what you've seen here is a very interesting survey of the span of the 19th and the 20th century, and the way that in the last paper, pantomime is being used to reflect upon itself, and perhaps not that successfully in terms of the very fact of it being humorous and funny seemed to be the way that, something that critics of the first production didn't quite respond to. What I was wondering was that, do you think, more recently people have complained about British education, historical education, and the fact that the Opium Wars are not something that generally were taught in British schools. So do you think in the 1980s audiences would have been familiar with that history, or would that pantomime have confronted them with it, and for perhaps the first time?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, and actually there is one review which states, thank goodness I was made to do a project on this when I was 8 years old or whatever, because otherwise I would have had no idea what this is. And as many of you will know, the history of the Opium Wars is very, very complicated. And to try and shove that into 2.5 hours of a pantomime which doesn't use Aladdin but uses Dick Whittington as its thing was very confusing in itself. So you've got the confusing sort of historical narrative there being used with the Dick Whittington narrative, but also this very odd thing of the RSC production and the audience is really not getting whether they're supposed to be moved, joining in, whether they are, when they're invited to, when they're not. And that is one of the things that those reviews criticise a lot, that what are they trying to say here? And actually a lot of them just got far too involved, which I think is interesting because it exposes that pantomime sort of, patriotism. But this message got completely lost, and rather than it being on the Opium Wars, it was just a jolly good romp through Britain's past, and huzzah, hip hooray, what a frabjous day. Did you ever see such a wonderful dish of Chinese takeaway? I mean, we can read Nichols' message into that, but I think that was lost on a lot of the audience because they did not know this part of history.
And was he... You said that he was disappointed.
He was angered, really hated it.
Because he thought that it was too sparkly and spectacular.
Absolutely.
And he saw what he'd written coming through in quite a different way.
Yeah, because that
even
message
though he knew he was
lost.
dealing with pantomime.
That's the thing. I think that he also, there is an aside to this in that there are different reports, but the production, I think, if Nichols had made a different decision, would have occurred at the Theatre of Stratford East, much in the line of Jane Littlewood's work, Oh, What a Lovely War.
So it would have been contextualised differently.
Yes, for reasons that did not occur. So, of course, what happened was the RSC are straight bang into their brand new theatre. They want to show off the flying, the wonderful technology that they have there. Afterwards, Peter Pan was staged, and that was very successful. So they wanted to show off the theatre, and in a way, that glitz and glamour meant that anything else got lost in amongst that. Unless, as you were saying, you knew about the Opium Wars and you were very aware of the history that is there.
It would go over your head.
A lot of them made these Thatcher.
Do you know whether there was any response from the Chinese community?
I don't. And very interestingly, the production was, when it was remounted in the West End, it was by a group of American financiers who wanted to enter in the theatrical realm and were going to transport it to Broadway. Now, that didn't happen because of equity discussions that broke down over the transfer of actors here and there. And how it would have been received on Broadway is another very interesting thing. Obviously, it never happened. But number one, it's a pantomime. It's a very, it's an aspect of British history, what's being presented. And I think the message would have been even more lost because it would have once again been this spectacle.
Because Americans aren't so familiar with the pantomime tradition, are they?
It's like a British, British tradition. So something probably
And I think the reason that they were interested was it won the Society of West End Theatre Award the year before for Best Musical, and they did bring over Broadway choreographer and stuff. So making it more musical-like, and in the line of Broadway.
Okay, well, I would like to throw this open to the audience now to give you a chance to ask Dongshin or Simon any questions if you have any. Sarah?
The question for Dongshin, I really enjoyed your talk and thinking about these questions of, why is this Chinese, or is this costume Chinese, this costume, or this costume more Chinese than this costume?
Is it on? Is it working?
Does she have to start again? Sorry.
I'll try and say that.
more quickly. I really enjoyed your paper and these questions of what makes a costume particularly Chinese or not at all recognisable as Chinese, and tracing this back through the centuries and thinking about it in relation to particular historical contexts and cultural contexts such as chinoiserie. And you had, at one point, you had a lovely juxtaposition between two slides. I think it was a French one and a British one. And there was one that you were suggesting was a more realistic portrayal of Chinese costume and perhaps Chinese interiors, and one that perhaps had other kinds of messages that it was trying to put across. And of course, we're dealing all the time with conventions of theatricality, which makes these readings of Orientalism even more interesting and complex. But I just wondered if you might offer some interpretation of how you would see these moments of realisticness versus these moments of clearly overt fantasy, and some other questions as well, perhaps.
Okay.
But I just wanted to invite you to maybe...
Yes. Thank you.
Because I haven't read your thesis, so I'd quite like to hear some of your interpretation of that moment.
At this moment, this is what I think that I would. Earlier, I gave a very broad overview, right? And what I would like to do in the book is really to look at each production specifically, and like what Simon did wonderfully, to look into it and to see who the producers were and how the audience received it, etc. So at this moment I find it more productive to not to judge the productions in relation to authenticity, but in relation to what would be their from my reading, what would be their purpose, what are they trying to do in that production. And whether they do any research into the costume, etc., and how that happened. Would that just from their stock inventory, from the back, and they just attach something to it, that's Chinese, right? Or did they really do a lot to make it really authentic looking as a way to attract people to come and see real thing? That one thing like what Simon just did, that slide is really also wonderful, like the ISC poster is actually a Chinese mask, and right again about the Chinese theater makeup and costume, and then with the banners at the back, and then but this one you will see the Half Moon Theater. Actually, it just looks British to me, So then and to make fun of it. So probably what would be really good is really to look into each production, and then to look at similar productions and discuss them, and then as well that there were lots of confusions between the Chinese and especially later the Japanese. Then when Japan ascended to modernism and took over, and then Mikado, and then later on. So it's interesting to find these traces. Well, meanwhile, at the same time, knowing that there's larger picture that we need to consider, because that we could come across like actually very few. Say that very few Chinese characters were played by the Chinese.
And just to interject that, in my research, there has never ever been an Emperor of China in Aladdin played by a Chinese actor. There's been Malaysian actors, there's been Japanese actors a lot, but in my research, I've never ever been able to find a Chinese, which is interesting. Yeah.
So then this goes back to many complicated issues about representation, who is hired or who is asked to perform the Chinese, right, by the skin color or something. So you see that I think that we would definitely need to tackle each case one by one. Yes.
So you look at each case one by one, because you did say in theatre there's space for imagination and spectacle, and therefore authenticity is not something that you. But historically, it's interesting how you look at different resources and different sources, and then what's being represented. What struck me is the way that what I didn't really know is, and I think in the more recent or American productions, there are Chinese theatre itself is incorporated into these productions, where I've never noticed that in, say, 19th century British Chinese theatrical spectacle. You don't get that representation of actual Chinese theatrical performance, I don't think.
That's
in that way.
that's
I don't
correct.
think so.
Yeah, and then we will see that in the early 19th century, you will see all these incorporations of the actual Chinese scenes in the scenery. Then they'll have all these quick scene changes.
Yes.
So to make that a spectacle, real Chinese scenes, and then really to incorporate the Chinese, state theater practices came in really, I
Much
think,
later.
much later in the, after
20th
the,
century.
I would say maybe in the late 19th century, because starting in the mid 18th century, they were, in addition to missionaries, like all these armies, there were also scholars, sinologists who were interested
Can you
in...
think of any productions that would have done that?
Oh, actual production.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
I know in the early 20th century, theatrical practice was then affected by Chinese theatre practice
correct.
in the kind of modernist plays that Diana will be talking about a bit later.
Yes.
Anyway, does anybody else have a question?
Apropos Poppy, which I'm sorry I never saw, but I've worked in theatre for a number of years. And I think to stress pantomime was probably a mistake, because to the great British public, pantomime is something that you don't have to think about. It's just fun. You don't expect anything to be authentic whatsoever. We saw a picture of Dick Whittington showing her legs. That's always Principal Boy. The dame is always a woman, and they're comic characters. So I think probably why everyone was so confused about Poppy was because and use the word pantomime. It's just two completely different things. That's all I think that should have been clear in terms of if one is trying to. I know it was, ironic, etc. As I say, I'm sorry I didn't see it, but what I know of it. But it's not going to, and I don't think it's helped that perception of Chineseness in the theatre. I don't think Poppy has. And I think all those old, Chinese is still very much there for the great British public.
Definitely. I think that, Nichols afterwards said, I'm not going to write again because of how this has been done. And through his work, he often uses these popular forms to try and make a political statement, as with the others. But absolutely, pantomime is such a thing that British people, as I was saying, grow up with, and they just entered in it with the fun of that, because that's as it was framed. It was framed as, a patriotic pantomime. And absolutely, I think that those reasons are there, and I think that's why he was so frustrated that nobody could see, or that in a way that it had failed theatrically because of that. In the sense of an audience member, excellent, joy would join in on all that, but absolutely all those reasons that you were saying, he was very... And I think even more so after the Half Moon production, where he thought, okay, I can readdress some of this, it still just didn't work because pantomime was the issue, and there was some excellent writing by W.B. Worthing, especially, who goes into those reasons of failure and pantomime, definitely.
Thank you. If you'd like to.
My question's for Simon. I find the comparison between the first production RSC and the Half Moon Theatre fascinating. And I'm wondering if it is an example of something that I've been trying to figure out, which is this question of English humour in pantomime, and if English pantomime is something that is fun and humorous and frivolous and is not to be taken seriously, then is Poppy a comment? And even almost like the RSC production exists on its own as too much of that tradition. And is Poppy more, if it's an example of Nichols claiming his original intention back, is it something about black irony, and is it more about something that is almost using this tradition of pantomime as a way to propagate imperialist agendas, whether it's imperialist or British nationalist or and is it actually definitely I mean, you can see it from this poster, like you say, and I'm just wondering if it really is something about humour that can't actually take a joke.
Possibly. You have to be very aware of the lens through which to read it.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm pushing it too far,
No,
but
no,
it's
no.
just the questions
But
of
those
humour is...
early pantomimes that if you read Anne's book, you can find a lot about those early Aladdins, and as we will now demonstrate here, this is the Anne fan club on the stage. Yeah, and I think that there's this whole range of early pantomime being exclusive, and I can see Ross at the back there, so he might want to jump in a minute, about being perhaps propaganda in that sense of communicating those ideas. Obviously, that I think those are still inherent in there. If you think about how we do portray other cultures in pantomime today, some companies are trying to get rid of that. Abenazer has been made the worst villain of them all, a British banker. So we're turning that round, and some places are trying to, get rid of all those things. So rather than go to Morocco in Dick Whittington, you get shipwrecked under sea, or for example, in one production, you instead of getting shipwrecked in China, it's actually Chinatown, and they play with all those ideas that they think they're in China, but they're actually in the centre of London. So yeah, I think there's that, and there's that playfulness. But I think that you're right, it is this sense of humour, and I'm just thinking back to the conversations we had at Lancaster about we only really take the mick out of that we're really fond of. So are we fond of pantomime in this? Or could you read it that we're fond of,
Our imperial past.
Our imperial past, and it's
We
led
are.
to where we are today, and morphed into Commonwealth. There are lots of different debates which could go on about that and Britain's role as a global power or non-global power, and its motives and all of that today.
It's very confusing. Pantomime was it was used as a mode of subversion in many, many ways, but it's because it became so established at that high Victorian moment, that's when it kind of became the form that we know today, grand pantomime, that maybe it's so set in that moment. Before it was far more perhaps a vehicle that you could use more subversively, but maybe it means it just isn't. And I think, Nichols' script is very humorous and self-reflective, but it's in the performance that perhaps it fails, doesn't it? As you were saying, it just re-establishes all of those stereotypes at the same time as trying to subvert them.
That's the biggest problem.
Yeah, and it just doesn't quite work.
If I may put in something to say is that there seems to be one strain of criticism on Anne Butterfly. It's about stereotyping the Chinese and the West, and then but Huang's intention was to criticize all these stereotypical ideas and thoughts, but some of the critics don't think that the message comes across. So it seems there's a point of reception and understanding of the past. Yes.
Yes, David, sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting that. I think one of the things you cannot control how the audience are going to react to anything. So I'm really interested in this idea that Nichols thought it. Do you know if he wrote it thinking it was going to be at Stratford East?
This is where it's really difficult to actually 100% say. Afterwards, all this stuff came out. Basically, I wish I'd have gone to Stratford East, and actually some of the reviews of the original 1982 production do state, what would have happened had it have gone to Stratford East as we're told it was. I don't know any more than that.
Because obviously, Oh, What a Lovely War would be such a useful analogue.
Exactly. And actually, a lot of the many of the reviews do make comparisons. What if it had been in that vein? And that's why it failed. And I remember reading this and hearing about this production for the first time, and I actually thought that it would have been in the Pit, the Barbican smaller place, to get that intimacy where they could have done that much more. But no, it was on the main stage and used every single piece of equipment that they could possibly get.
It strikes me that one of the ways to make the panto thing work would be to have the audience believe they're having a good time, some of them, and then to take that away from them and turn it around on them. But I don't think any audience would ever thank you for doing that.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, that's where, Nichols said quite a lot, this custard pie full of razor blades. The razor blades never really came through in that, because it wasn't turned around. Okay. Yeah. Even with the Gatling guns and stuff, the metaphorical.
Okay. how much more time have we got, Diana, for questions? Okay, so Lucy, did you?
I was just thinking, is part of the reason why the initial production of Poppy failed the fact that there is not a common social perception from the host nation of what Chinese is in relation to the British community. Therefore, you're asking an audience to look at something that is satirical, ironic, without actually having a basis to know what is actually truly Chinese and what is actually a cipher or a stereotype, given the fact that we are, as you pointed out, often the first representation of anything Chinese for a kid is pantomime.
Is Aladdin.
So where do you start from then when you're being asked to question a stereotype or something that isn't actually essentially real? It's quite a lot for an audience to do, and in terms of context, I'm wondering if it had gone to Stratford East, whether that would have been less of a burden, given the history of the type of productions that theatre was famous for.
Yeah, the framing of the productions there most definitely, and I think it goes back to those debates about it not people generally not knowing about the Opium Wars, and in the program, which I do have with me if anyone wants to see it in the break, there is very long essays about that, but when you're in the theatre, you hardly want to do that and go, okay, this is the frame. I'm now going to read it through. I can remember all those dates and all those things that occurred. You can't, and actually, it's quite difficult to pick up all of them, having even researched it and done all of that, because it gets quite exhaustive. Trying to read it and going out and it being done all that to try and keep reading it through that way.
Familiarity with that
Exactly,
history, which audiences probably didn't really have then and maybe don't have much more of now, particularly.
Absolutely. And the fact that it does sort of merge those two, Aladdin and Dick Whittington together, I think people are reading it through that lens much more and are, in a sense, also reading it more as an attack on Thatcher and about what is happening at the time, rather than these questions that we're looking at why it did or did not work.
Okay, Ross, sorry. Can you... Thanks, Claire. I'll come to you next.
It's more of a comment really than a question, but I was wondering whether we shouldn't or wouldn't want to make the connection in terms of this idea of imperial nostalgia with the television production of The Jewel and the Crown, which was not that long after, and which Rushdie very powerfully critiqued in terms of the way in which it was said to be critical, but was actually reifying patterns of imperial nostalgia, and there was quite a lot of debate about that. So it's a very, very parallel story about how imperialism is being used in popular culture at about the same time.
And of course, it is the time of the revival of Victorian values, and you do see that in the merchant ivory productions and things. So that's another context, even though there's a strong anti-Thatcherite political movement happening as well, but perhaps not amongst the RSC audience so much as the other one, obviously.
Yes, and at the same time you have, in America, you have Gertrude Himmelfarb, a Reaganite, right, reviving the notion of Victorian values quite prominently, and that flows transatlantically as well.
This lady here in the front.
Hello. Sorry I didn't get to hear the first gentleman's talk, but I heard Simon's. 1 point and 2 questions, actually. I don't like pantos, just as a general rule.
That's fine. Next question. No, joking.
Thank you. Just because I've only been to a couple when I was probably in my teens, and then as an adult. I was born and raised here. I'm British Chinese, I'm an actress, I'm in the creative field. I got nothing from it. This huge British tradition of pantomime, I took as a complete send-up Mick take. I found it incredibly offensive, and not just from the whole kind of Chinese side of it and portrayal of, my people, I suppose, but anything else that was going on, whether it was, just people in general. It wasn't about necessarily cultures, whether you're fat or got glasses or whatever it is, short, tall, whatever, class issues. This constant total, taking the piss all the time. I absolutely got nothing from it. It just contained no substance whatsoever, and I just thought it was a complete waste of money. And I had no idea most of the time what people were laughing about, and that may be a complete, sense of failure, sense of human failure on my part. But I hope that I was intelligent enough and open-minded enough to, consider what I was seeing on stage. That's my point. I don't like Panto. In its current incarnation, I would have been so interested to have seen Poppy and just the taglines that it gives. Pantomime. I was really interested. Pantomime for all patriotic, dirty-minded families, splendidly vulgar.
Yeah.
I mean, that certainly would have caught my imagination and caught my interest. You said there were investors who are interested in transferring.
Yes.
Were they British or American investors?
American.
Okay, and do you know what their interest was for transferring it?
Well, they wanted to break out into theatre. They weren't theatrically. They didn't. Their business was not theatre before, and that year had been not a great year for the West End in terms of new productions. Now, I still find it quite intriguing that they wanted to do this. Obviously, it has the RSC name attached to it. It did won the Society for West End Theatre Award of that year, a very weak year for musicals. So perhaps that were the reasons. The reason that it did not is because Equity UK and America have, as many of you will know, this thing where if X amount appear over here, there has to be a fair exchange. That broke down because of it not occurring.
Was that the sole reason?
That is the sole reason that is given. I can find no other reasons, and indeed my supervisor says that's very odd because I was an MD around that time. It seems really weird that we weren't, that should be the sole reason. Reported extensively in the Stage and other newspapers about that. But yeah, that's the reason that I can find at this moment.
So again, that's the official.
That's the official reason. That's the official reason. I mean, I would have loved to have heard accounts from those investors who finally saw the production, or if they ever did. And obviously, it was mounted by them in a model for the RSC in the West End. As I said, they flew in this American choreographer. A lot of the audience participation went out, but it goes back in that sense to in American, perhaps that audience having the response you did to the British pantomime of what is going on. It's really offensive. Or perhaps getting involved and going, oh, the RSC, jolly good fun, wonderful. This is theatre in Britain. This is what's happening now. There are some theatres, Stratford, East Hackney, which are obviously trying to readdress those issues that you expressed with your, perhaps hatred is too big a word, but those real issues. And I think it's interesting reading pantomime through those lenses, as you did, which obviously Poppy may have spoke to you in a very interesting way, and you would have picked those things up, to most of the audience perhaps who didn't, and perhaps would have also embraced the pantomime in that sense. I mean, in a sense, it's going back to those things of fairy tales and what do they do? And most of the fairy tales, they're stealing in, the other culture is portrayed as a villain. That's why I find it in my research quite interesting that suddenly Britain's becoming the villain. Abanaz, for example, British, Ugly Sisters, very, very British, other villainy coming there, turning on its head. But yeah, interesting.
So final point is just to note, again, when it comes to the Chinese community over the Black and South Asian community, it's what's going on subconsciously, it's what's going on covertly, it's what's not being said and not being out in the open when issues are regarding this community.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, I think we need to stop there for our coffee break. So as before, there's coffee up in room 157. Simply because we're not allowed to serve it in here, which is a bit of a drag, but gives you a chance to stretch your legs. And we'll start again at 12. Thank you. And thank you once again to these wonderful speakers.